Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 2 of my NES Retrospective. This time we're going through the year 1986, which is the year that the NES was really released nationwide. There were 19 releases this year, and most of them were notable, so I'm going to go through all of them. I only have a couple here just because, I have to be really picky with my NES collection. If you haven't seen the first part of this retrospective where I go through the limited release in 1985 and talk about, my collection stuff, check that out because there's a lot of great stuff there. And if you haven't seen any of my retrospectives, check them out. I do a bunch of consoles where I go through the libraries, starting with the exclusive stuff and then going to the multi-platform stuff. Of course, I think almost everything with NES was exclusive, so we're going to be going through a lot of stuff here. And yeah, thanks for checking this one out. Subscribe if you want to get notified when my other retrospectives are coming out and to show some support for me, which I really appreciate. To get things going, let's talk a bit about 1986. After the limited release in New York City, we finally got a wider release in North America and Europe. It's hard to know exactly when stuff was available nationwide, but a bunch of new titles started rolling out in June, so I'm going to imagine that's when it was pretty much available in most places. Just to mention it again, the dates for this stuff is really up in the air. We don't know exactly when anything came out, so I'm going to try to go through it in chronological order, but I have mostly months to go by. At the beginning of this year, we see a whole bunch more black box releases, just stuff only put out by Nintendo, so let's get started with that stuff. Starting off with a bunch of releases from the Arcade Classics series, starting off with games I don't have, but I do think are very notable, and I don't have them for a reason we'll get into in a later video, but that is the original Donkey Kong arcade game. This was a port of the arcade smash that put Nintendo on the map as a video game company. It is the best of many console ports at the time. The game features 3 of the 4 levels from the original game, skipping the original level 3. The game has the player controlling Mario, or as he was known at the time, Jumpman, climbing each stage to reach Donkey Kong and save his kidnapped girlfriend Pauline. The last stage has the player jumping over rivets in order to topple the scaffolding that Donkey Kong is standing on. After beating that, the game loops with harder difficulties. The follow-up to Donkey Kong sees Donkey Kong Jr. trying to rescue his trapped father from Mario, who's imprisoned him after the first game. Gameplay still consists of avoiding obstacles in order to get through each stage, but Donkey Kong Jr. has some new moves including climbing and moving between vines. This port includes all 4 levels from the original arcade game. Then we get to the first game in my collection, one I highly recommend checking out if you haven't, just because it is so wildly different from the others. That is Donkey Kong 3. The third Donkey Kong game is drastically different from the first 2. It's not even really a platformer, and it doesn't feature Mario at all. The game has the player controlling Stanley the Bugman. Donkey Kong for some reason has moved into his greenhouse and is letting insects loose that are destroying his precious flowers. Armed with his bug spray, Stanley must fight off the bugs and get Donkey Kong out. So it plays more like a shooter at that point. Stanley can move and fire at Donkey Kong to push him back upwards, and the level ends when he's pushed far enough. The game has 3 stages which repeat as the difficulty increases. The stages are fairly similar in design compared to the way previous Donkey Kong stages were differentiated. Following that, another good arcade port of a classic Nintendo arcade game. That is Mario Brothers. This is the port of the arcade game that named Mario, where he and Luigi try to rid the sewers of 4 types of monsters. In order to do so, the creatures must be flipped over by hitting the floor from beneath them and then kicking them before they get up. The game also introduced the POW block, which would flip over all creatures once when hit. And finally, it can be played by 2 players co-op. While the game isn't that fun, it's cool to see where Mario really started. The next game I have, and maybe the last in the Arcade Classics series, is Popeye. This was apparently a game that Miyamoto originally wanted to create, but when the license plans fell through, he turned his concepts into what became Donkey Kong. When Nintendo eventually did get the license back, they made this arcade game, which doesn't quite hold up to Donkey Kong, but is still a pretty decent game in its own right. The game has 3 stages where Popeye must rescue Olive Oyl from danger while dealing with Bluto, the Sea Hag, and other dangers. In each stage, Olive Oyl throws down items that Popeye has to collect to complete the levels. These include hearts, musical notes, and letters. In feel and tone, it's very similar to Donkey Kong, but a very different experience. That brings us to a really interesting game, Donkey Kong Jr. Math. This was the first Donkey Kong title that wasn't a port of an arcade game and is a strange educational title where Donkey Kong Jr. tries to teach the player basic arithmetic. Answers to questions are selected by collecting the numbers by climbing on vines. The game performed so poorly that Nintendo apparently cancelled plans for future educational games. It's also fairly rare. I think it's the most expensive loose black box game, actually. All of those games were released in June. We're finally moving into August with Balloon Fight. This was a decent clone of Joust that has a player with 2 balloons trying to take down enemies. Hitting an enemy's balloon from higher pops one, and when both are popped, the enemies fall and are out of the match. The goal is to clear each screen of enemies. After every 3 stages, the player will get a bonus round where 20 balloons enter the screen and the player has to pop as many as they can. The main game is okay, but in my opinion the better part of the game is the balloon trip mode. This is an endless scrolling mode where you have to avoid obstacles while trying to get as far as possible. Next up, the last of the light gun black box games is actually the most unique, Gumshoe. Gumshoe stars a detective looking for diamonds to pay off the ransom for the kidnapped Jennifer. The game is a mix of a light gun shooter and a platformer. It has the player shooting the detective on screen, which causes him to jump. This helps him get through all the platforming segments. The player can also shoot down enemies or just have the detective jump over them. There are 4 stages in the game. Following that is Mach Rider, a strange motorbike racing game set in the year 2112 that's basically Death Race meets Hang On. Controls involve steering, shifting gears, and firing the bike's weapons. The game features 4 modes. The fighting mode is the main race, which takes over 10 stages and has the player avoiding or shooting obstacles and other racers. If the player finishes those 10 stages, the game starts over but with 10 new tracks, so there's basically 20 tracks in the game that keep getting repeated. The endurance mode is like a standard arcade racer where the player has a time limit for each sector. The solo mode is also the same as endurance but with no other racers on the road. And finally, the build mode is a track editor just like Excitebike. Like that game, the tracks can't be saved on the NES. Following that, a pretty infamous fighter, Urban Champion. This is an early and very basic take on a fighting game in which the player takes on a stream of thugs one at a time in front of a series of buildings. The player can use light or heavy punches in order to knock their opponent back, and they advance when their opponent is pushed off the screen or into an open manhole that some stages have. The game has 145 fights that the player must win in order to become the Urban Champion. And that's it for the Nintendo published black box releases of the year. We'll get a couple more black box releases next year, but now starting in October in 1986, we're getting into the third-party stuff finally coming out. The first of which is Tag Team Wrestling, a port of the arcade wrestling game by Technos Japan, who would go on to make classics like Double Dragon and River City Ransom. In the NES version, the teams are the Strong Bads and the Ricky Fighters, and each character has a unique move. The game features a series of single-player tournaments and a 2-player mode. Following that, we got Chubby Cherub, a strange action platformer starring a Cupid-like character who's trying to save his friends from burglars. The original Famicom game was based on the manga titled Obake no Kyutaro and starred a ghost instead of a cherub. This game had major modifications for its English release. In the game, Chubby Cherub must get through 12 stages, avoiding cats and dogs, and collecting food that allows him to fly, so that he can more easily avoid the enemies. Following that, the same month as Tag Team Wrestling for the NES, we get Muscle. This is a much better wrestling game. It's based on the popular Kinnikuman manga series in Japan, though we didn't really know that over here at the time. It was called Muscle here, and that name was best known for the tiny wrestling figure toys that were released also based on the Japanese manga. The game had 1 and 2 player modes and featured single and doubles matches. There were 8 playable wrestlers who could jump, punch, and perform a number of other wrestling maneuvers. It also featured 3 different ring types: the standard ring, the ice top ring, and the electric rope ring. Next up was Ninja Kid, another game based on a manga that was stripped of its license to appeal more to English-speaking players. The original game was based on the GGG no Kitaru manga in Japan, which I've never heard of, and I imagine many people haven't, so the NES version was heavily modified for release. In the game, the player can jump and attack with the acquired weapons, including throwing stars, boomerangs, fireballs, and the special flying feather attack. The game lets the player choose from 3 temples to play through, where they'll get a challenge to complete in a side-scrolling stage. Once completing the challenge, they'll have to choose a door which randomly completes the level or has them face a boss up top a tower. The missions and stage variants are random, so the game is really interesting because you can replay it multiple times to see new content. Following that, in November, we got 1942, a port of Capcom's popular arcade World War II vertical shooter, and one of the first home conversions that Capcom did internally. Overall, it's a pretty mediocre port of the original, but still a decent game if you didn't know better. Controls are move, shoot, and do a loop that gives you temporary invincibility. There are also several power-ups, most notably a weapon increase that doubles your firepower, a screen clearing attack, and one that calls in 2 allies to fly and attack with you. The game featured 32 stages and 4 bosses. Another Capcom arcade port, Commando, comes out next. This is the top-down shooter starring Super Joe. Controls let the player move, shoot, and throw grenades. The game features 4 missions, each with 4 areas, and there are helpful items that can be picked up, as well as hidden ladders which lead to bonus areas. Overall, it's a pretty fun game. It doesn't really hold up now, and the controls aren't great, but still notable for the time. And following that, another Capcom game, Ghosts and Goblins. This is an arcade port of the infamously difficult game. The first game in the Ghosts and Goblins series is a side-scrolling action platformer starring the knight Arthur trying to save the princess from the king of the demon world, aka Satan. Arthur can only take 2 hits before losing a life, but the game has 5 different weapons that the player can get that can really help or hurt depending on the enemies he has to go up against. Notably, the game has to be completed twice in a row in order to see the true ending. Now we're into December with another classic arcade port, this time by Konami. Gradius is a port of the horizontal shoot-'em-up, and the first game in the influential Gradius series. The game puts the player in control of the Vic Viper ship, taking down enemies to reach the boss at the end of each of the 7 levels. Gameplay is notable for its power-up system, in which your ship starts off at a severe disadvantage, but by using power-ups you can increase your speed, change your weapons, add shields and options, which help you fight and depending on your choices can eventually turn you in a near unstoppable killing machine. That is until you take a hit and have to start all over from the last checkpoint with nothing. And lastly, ending off the year on a low note, Karate Champ. This is a port of the very early competitive fighter developed by Technos Japan. The NES version is based on the 2-player version of the arcade game, which came out later, and the game features a series of one-on-one matches. Each match has rounds which end when a single hit is landed. Whoever gets 2 points first wins the match, so very much built around karate tournaments, and just a really early attempt at a fighting game. And that's it for 1986. Things are still pretty slow now. The NES is still relatively unknown, but next year and definitely the year after that, there's going to be a ton of stuff to go through. So thanks for checking out this retrospective. I'll see you guys next time.